even though these events and what took place are huge and many, many, many people know about them, as high school students especially, when studying this type of literature and these places in the world, a lot of people don't even know that Burundi is a country. So how did you go about developing Deo's story in this sense and making it so accessible and, quote, readable
Well,
for a wide variety of
that's a good
audiences?
question. First of all, I didn't know Burundi existed before I met him, honestly. Nor did my editor. I have an editor I've had for 40 years. And I don't know why. I mean, one could make some guesses as to why the catastrophe in Rwanda got to be so well known, whereas the 13-year-long, this horrifying civil war in Burundi almost never made the New York Times. You know, it was. I mean, there were people in Africa who knew what was going on, obviously, Nelson Mandela among them. But how to make it accessible? Well, my editor is a very smart guy. I wrote this. I write a lot of drafts of any book, tons and tons of drafts, 10 sometimes or so. And the hardest part for me is usually writing the rough draft. The thing I often do, I just try to get through it. I don't turn away from any possibility, and I've said this too many times, but I write as fast as I can to prevent remorse for having written badly, and just get it out. And I try to do it, in this case, I especially tried to do it chronologically, because then I really forced myself to know the chronology of a story. It's amazing how often a writer doesn't actually know what happened when, you know. It doesn't mean you have to end up telling the story in the order in which things happen. You just can't pretend that things happen when they didn't, you know. But there was and so I started with his childhood in Burundi and took him onward. But my editor pointed out that this was difficult for a reader, an American reader particularly, Western reader who might not even know there was such a place as Burundi. Better to start him on his way to New York, put him in a familiar place, unfamiliar to him, familiar to us, and then move back. We ended up with this kind of nice symmetry. But there's a story connected with that's kind of funny, I think. We were just thinking about this first part of this book, and we really hadn't dealt with the other things yet, but we were trying to solve this problem of how to make this feel accessible, and or just how to make it work. That's what you think about at the time. You know, why isn't this more alive and so on? And we were sitting on a porch in a cottage in Maine. We each had a yellow pad of paper, and a kind of nervous silence, at least nervous to me, had fallen over us. And I just was doodling on my thing, and I made a little diagram. I had some arrows going one way and arrows going the other. And I said, well, finally I said, this is all I've got. And I turned it to him, and he smiled, and he turned his thing to me, and he had practically the identical diagram. But we were, you know, I said something like, we've been doing this too long. But of course, I was pleased. Yeah. And we had to work it all out. And so there's a sort of symmetry. I mean, it's an old technique in media res. You know, you begin medias res. You begin in the middle and you move backward. But in this case, we'd start with him going to New York and stay there long enough to sort of establish him there, and then begin to go back and tell you with the Burundian chapters. And the Burundian chapters would get longer, and the New York ones would get shorter. And then the whole thing would come back around with the consular official in New York saying good luck in New York. I mean, in Bujumbura saying good luck in New York. I don't know. It seemed to work. And as a carpenter, I once wrote about how to phrase, you know, when he'd finished a piece of work, he'd say perfect or equal.